Senator Humphries.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I want to address a number of things which have been raised in this debate, but I'll start with that point that was raised by Senator Marshall at the end, where he talked about how robust this system of funding building projects in schools might be, and how flexible the bureaucrats are in facing difficulties or problems that the schools might have in accepting certain template projects. And I certainly did hear those assurances given by the department, but I also heard the words of Henry Grosek, the principal of the Berwick Lodge Primary School in Melbourne, when he wrote this about what was going on when he encountered, in a practical sense, what was going on with the particular project that his school wanted. He wanted to have certain projects that the department didn't want him to have. And he said, schools are being harassed into signing off on templates they didn't want. And he went on to say that state bureaucrats are, and I quote, being complicit in the siphoning off of vast sums from government schools, particularly given that they accepted templates that with only the flimsiest of building details and a total absence of cost valuations. Yes, projects might have been sorted out in the case of that school eventually, but unless principals take steps like that, are they going to get those sorts of outcomes? Are they going to get those sorts of outcomes? I have my doubts. And why should they be forced in the first place to accept templates that don't suit their needs? And this is one of the things I want to come back to in this debate, which is the question of whether schools should be initiating these projects or whether it ought to be the bureaucrats and the government sitting here in splendid isolation in this city. Nobody would question a real investment in education. No one would want to attack a program that does actually improve the quality of classroom teaching in this country. And in other circumstances, you'd have to say that an investment of $14.7 billion in schools would be very good news indeed. But the longer and the harder that we look at this particular project, this spectacularly large project, the longer one begins to wonder about what exactly is going on. The more one sees options for sustained improvement in classes, in classrooms, actually being passed by in the pursuit of flimsy headlines, the more one realises that this whole program is one of missed opportunities, rushed decisions, flawed process, and bypassing and disempowering local communities who have a better idea of what they can achieve in their own school communities than do other people. Mr Acting Deputy President, Labor is very good at spending money. What they are not so good at is spending it well. And that is the point that's been raised with this matter of public importance today, not the magnitude of this investment in education. Nobody begrudges putting a lot of money into education. The former government did that. This government appears to be doing it. Nobody has an issue with investing heavily in education. But we owe it to a community like ours, particularly at a time when our economy is at such risk, to spend every dollar of government revenue in this context in the best possible way and to waste none of it. Endlessly talking about how these programs are meant to work and talking about the size of the investment does not cover up the key question here, which is how well targeted or planned is this investment. Now, it needs to be said that good schools are not defined by the quality of their bricks and mortar. You don't get a good school merely because it's new and it's got lots of new facilities and infrastructure, nor are old schools or even run-down schools necessarily bad schools. But the quality of infrastructure in those schools is one element. It's part of the answer to producing better quality educational outcomes, but not, I emphasise, the whole answer. A good illustration of this is the way that the government has approached the question of distance education. Initially, school or facilities that catered for provision of distance education in Australia were not to be eligible for the Building the Education Revolution funding. They were completely off the radar. It was only when this issue was raised in the Sound Estimates Committees a couple of weeks ago that the government indicated it would be revising its position and coming back to look at whether it could in fact put money into a building or a school which had no infrastructure, but whose quality of outcomes is very important to the students who happen to be enrolled in those sorts of educational opportunities. The important point about the government's program, and this goes to that important point about the government's program, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a program built around deciding in advance what schools need. Contrast that with what the previous government put forward, the Investing in Our Schools program, which was a community-driven exercise. We didn't say to people, you know, you will have a library, you will have an all-purpose hall, you will have X number of computers. We said to them, what do you want? What makes your school a better school? What does your community want to see happening in that school? And people put their hands up in droves and they got outcomes that they wanted because they got the money that they were after, they got the processes that they could drive in their own local communities, and they were happy with those outcomes. And I'm afraid what we're going to see happen with this Building the Education Revolution so-called program is precisely the opposite. People being pushed as square pegs into round holes. I also want to address this question raised by Senator Marshall about the previous government's performance in education. It's raised constantly by those opposite, and it's completely untrue. When we came to government, the federal government was funding government schools across Australia to the tune of $1.4 billion a year. When we left office, nearly 12 years later, we were funding government schools to the tune of $3.5 billion, and that represents an increase in real terms of 77% across those 12 or so years. It is a complete untruth to suggest that the previous government neglected to fund education or in some way ran it down. I'm proud of the achievements we had in education. I'm proud particularly of the processes that we used. We didn't want to have, as far as investing in our schools were concerned, we didn't want to have a program driven by state government bureaucrats because, frankly, they're the ones who allowed recurrent investment in schools to decline, a decline which had to be addressed by the federal coalition government with its increased funding for government recurrent education across the states. So raw numbers don't make an education revolution. Throwing billions of dollars simply into a name, into a slogan, doesn't add up to a change in the outlook for Australian schools and Australian students. Even if $1 in every 5 of this program is misdirected or wasted, that represents a waste to the taxpayer of $3 billion. How much better could we spend $3 billion in the current environment?
Order, Senator, your time has expired.